Hello and welcome to Since Attlee and Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each midweek episode, we will be marvelling at glorious pearls of contemporary British political interest.
Well, we are on the precipice of a momentous change in British politics. Of course, Andy Burnham becoming leader of the Labour Party and subsequently Prime Minister. It's a change which, of course, once upon a time felt much more dramatic when we had a new Prime Minister coming in. We're rather more used to it than perhaps we ought to be. But what I wanted to talk about in this week's Matters of Interest is the Burnham bounce. Will there be one? Should we expect one? Or in fact, might there instead be a Burnham slump or no change at all in the opinion polls? And the way in which I wanted to frame that is by looking at what's happened in the past, in the post-war years, when a new Prime Minister has come in mid-term. And basically, you can break it down into three categories. First of all, there are the changes in Premiership when there is basically no change in the opinion polls. So, for example, in 1955, Winston Churchill resigns as Prime Minister. He's 80 by this point, and Anthony Eden, who people really expected to take over for a very, very long time, becomes Prime Minister. Of course, Eden's premiership ultimately proves to be a bit of a flop and ends in the debacle of Suez, and he resigns in January 1957. But what happens when Eden takes over from the aging warhorse, that is, Churchill? Well, basically next to nothing at all. If you look at the year leading up to the transition, so 1954, Labour is in the lead of between, say, 1% and 2%. Now, that was roughly sort of the mid-term position. And it's worth saying this is, of course, at a time when there were far fewer opinion polls than we get today. So there's basically Gallup doing polling at this time. So we're really depending upon one polling company in particular. But there's a modest Labour lead leading up to the year 1955. And then throughout 1955 itself, there is a Tory lead of around about 1% to 4% throughout. That doesn't seem to really change when Eden takes over. And then when the general election is called, the Tories lead by about 3.5% in the national poll at the general election. So that is an example of where basically nothing changes with the change of Prime Minister, at least from the headline voting intention figures. But it is worth saying that people did expect Churchill to go before the next election. Eden was very much expected to take over. So we're probably dealing with things that are baked in. And it's also, of course, really worth pointing out that this is already a very stable time in British politics. This is, the 1950s is pretty much the peak of two-party politics in Britain. And both of the parties have very large, stable voting blocks supporting their vote share. So you wouldn't necessarily expect to see this tumultuous or volatile change that we perhaps have got more used to in recent years. Fast forwarding another couple of decades and thinking about the Labour side, the Wilson to Callaghan transition is another one in which there's basically very little discernible impact in the opinion polls. So if you look at the voting share graph between 1974 and 1979, basically you get a modest Labour lead early on. It's then basically tied throughout much of 1975 and into 1976, including that period early in 1976 when Wilson resigns and Callaghan takes over. And then throughout the middle of the Parliament, the Tories open up a lead that then begins to drop towards late 78 into 79, and then the Tories open up a big lead again. So you do get some volatility in the polls, but it doesn't really overlap with when Harold Wilson retires and Jim Callaghan takes over. So that is always a possibility for when Burnham comes into number 10, that basically nothing happens with the opinion polls of any great note. A second category of change, of course, is that the party does a hell of a lot better when it gets a new Prime Minister and a new party leader. So two examples of that. One comes in 1990. Of course, Margaret Thatcher's been Prime Minister for 11 and a half years. The Tory polling performance has not been great leading up to her defenestration in November of 1990. There hadn't been any poll showing a Conservative lead since May 1989. So there'd been this quite sustained period of Labour leads. And then, of course, there's the most famous and bloody and brutal, in some respects, Tory leadership challenge in its modern history. She's challenged by Michael Heseltine, doesn't win by enough on the first ballot, and before the second ballot, she announces that she's resigning so that other people, like John Major and Douglas Hurd, can stand in that contest. And what's really interesting in that case is that it isn't the new leader that improves the Conservatives' performance in the polls, it's Margaret Thatcher's resignation. So if you look at the days leading up to the 22nd of November, the day she announces that she'll go, the Labour lead in the polls, in the, say, dozen or so opinion polls beforehand, was very often in the low teens, sometimes was in single digits, but was very often a significant Labour lead. After she announces that she's going, the Conservatives take the lead in the polls, and in fact lead in the 6 polls between her resignation and John Major becoming party leader and Prime Minister. John Major then continues that lead in office, although it begins to diminish actually towards the end of the year. And you do, in fact, by the end of the year, get an opinion poll with Labour in the lead once more. So what's really interesting in 1990 is that it seems to be relief that Margaret Thatcher is going that leads to an improvement in Tory fortunes rather than who is the replacement in and of itself in John Major. And of course, John Major goes on to win the 1992 election. Maybe the most dramatic example of when a party has done much better with a change of leader is in 2019. If you look at the chart of voting intentions throughout the 2017 to 2019 Parliament, although it's rather brief, the chart is absolute chaos. And in 2019 itself, you get moments where it looks as if the Lib Dems might be taking over in the polls. There's in fact one poll that has the Lib Dems in the lead at this time. There's a period when the Brexit Party take over. There's this tremendous slump in the Conservative fortunes and Labour fortunes, particularly as Theresa May struggles to get Brexit done, to coin a phrase. And by the time that Theresa May resigns as Prime Minister, the Tories are down to, say, 20% in the polls. And there has been the European elections where they polled less than 10%. The 40 or so polls leading up to the point at which Boris Johnson becomes leader had shown either a tie, a Labour lead, a Brexit Party lead, or, as I mentioned in one case, a Liberal Democrat lead. Post-Johnson, there is one poll that shows a 1% Labour lead, but then all the rest show Tory leads, and they're increasingly thumping Tory leads in the opinion polls, mostly in double figures. And of course, that leads us up to the 2019 general election, which gives a Tory majority of 80. So you then get those two examples of changing leader, and that leads to almost immediate success for the party. Cases where it seems like it's really paid off. People would argue that there were stings in the tail to come later on, of course, both with the defenestration of Thatcher and also with the actual leadership, the reality of leadership under Boris Johnson. But nevertheless, when you look at the polling figures in the next election, both of those appear like worthwhile gambles. And then finally, of course, there's a missing category so far, occasions when changing leader actually leads to a worse outcome. And of the two examples I'll pick there, one of them is obvious and one of them is, I think, much more interesting. The obvious one, of course, we will all remember it, we lived through it very recently, is when Boris Johnson resigns and Liz Truss takes over. So having achieved remarkable polling peaks, Johnson, at times during the COVID-19 pandemic, Johnson's standing in the country begins to fall, but the Tories are still polling over 30% when he resigns as Prime Minister. Under Truss, they plummet. Now, there's a YouGov poll at the end of September. It shows the Conservatives on 21% and Labour on 54%, 33% lead for Labour. And then by mid-October, you get a whole series of polling companies. Of course, by now, this is a much more diverse landscape of pollsters than it was in, say, the 50s or even the 70s. And you get all these pollsters, Savanta Conves, Redfield and Wilton, Data Poll, Survation, Omnisys, People Polling, Opinium, all showing Labour over 50% and the Tories way behind. And of course, that leads in part, alongside the fact that she has an economic agenda that Parliament won't vote for, to Liz Truss resigning. But the more interesting one, possibly, is 1957. And that's when Anthony Eden resigns. He's in ill health. He's also disgraced by Suez. And Harold Macmillan, later lionised as Super Mac in the cartoons, but a name that he was quite keen on, I think it's fair to say, himself. He takes over in January of 1957, and he would ultimately be Prime Minister for 6 years. But at that very point, he said to the Queen, apparently in their first audience, he cannot even guarantee the survival of the government for the next 6 weeks, in spite of the fact there was a healthy Conservative majority. So what happens to the polling in that case? Well, during the Suez crisis, Labour had a moderate lead, but not all that much of a lead, really. Towards the end of the year, they were ahead by a few percent. But then actually, in 1957, as Macmillan takes over, the Labour lead climbs. By March, Gallup has Labour ahead by 11.5%. In September, the Labour lead is said to be 18.5%. Now, slight pinch of salt. As I say, this is one polling company, and these are the early days of polling in some respects. But even by November, they're showing a lead of 12.5% for Labour in the polls. So Macmillan's first year taking over, the Conservatives are polling really poorly. And it takes until August of 1958 for some small Tory leads to begin to appear. And then in 1959, later on that year, there's a general election, and the Conservatives are ahead by more than 5.5% in the actual poll and end up with a majority of 100 seats. So the real reason I wanted to talk through that really is as we're thinking about what should we be looking for in the opinion polls as Andy Burnham takes over. Will there be a Burnham bounce? Won't there? Should we expect a slump instead? Recent history suggests that any of those are perfectly plausible options. But a few things that we can say about this transition so far. First of all, there's no evidence in the opinion polls that I can see that there is a sense of relief that Keir Starmer is going that is leading to a surge in Labour's performance, as there was for the Conservatives in 1990. That relief factor doesn't really seem in evidence, which is perhaps surprising given how unpopular Keir Starmer is and how relatively popular Andy Burnham is, and the widespread expectation that Burnham will take over. The second thing that I think stands out is that no change is a perfectly possible option in the opinion polls. We've not seen a change so far, and that is possibly how it will remain, that Burnham will have to prove himself in office. Simply the fact that he is in number 10 will not necessarily drag up Labour's performance in the polls, just in the way that, in fact, Kemi Badenoch's better performance as opposition leader and her relatively good ratings as an individual party leader have not dramatically pulled up the Conservatives' polling. So that's not obviously going to be the case that just Burnham coming in will change things. No change, as in 1955 or 1976, is perfectly possible. But the final thought I wanted to end on is that there's a bit of a paradox, I think, about Labour's polling at the moment, which we should bear in mind as we try and judge any bounce or otherwise, which is that Labour is polling both incredibly poorly and also quite well for midterm. The basis on which it's polling incredibly poorly is its vote share. Now, it's in the teens in most opinion polls. That's an appalling situation for a party that has a majority government to be in. But very often, because of Britain being a two-party system, what tends to happen is that if you look at how far behind is a governing party midterm, it can often be much, much worse than it is for Labour now. If we take the most dramatic example under Truss, when the Tories were 30-odd% behind Labour towards the end of 2022, well, that's not happening now. The current Reform and or Conservative leads over Labour are low in the single digits in most of the opinion polls that we're seeing. So, like I say, Labour is both polling appallingly and relatively well, depending on which metric you choose to use. And so if there is to be a Burnham bounce, I think the least that we would expect for that to be meaningful in any sense is for Labour to not necessarily be polling into the 30s anytime soon, but to be on course for leading in the opinion polls before too long.
Lots of interesting reflections, past and present there, Lee. Just a couple of things I wanted to pick out. Just first of all, thinking about Thatcher's resignation, of course, herself leaving office involuntarily. And in the Labour Party, there was huge sense of celebration initially that Thatcher was gone. There's the old joke by John O'Farrell that when Thatcher entered Downing Street in 1979, he and many Labour activists were chanting, "Maggie, Maggie, Maggie, out, out, out." And 11 years later, she heard the call and she got out. But it's interesting, Neil Kinnock did not quite share that same sense of elation. And while you were talking, I was unsuccessfully trying to find the reference that I've definitely come across where Kinnock encounters Labour staff who are absolutely jubilant at Margaret Thatcher's departure in November 1990, but Kinnock doesn't quite share the same sense of jubilation. He has a sense of foreboding that this is actually not going to be great for Labour, because there was a view in Labour that the Conservatives were probably going to have an election maybe in the spring of 1991. A lot of the Labour documents that I've looked at when I've gone through Kinnock's papers in that 1987 onwards Parliament often used 1991 as the assumption of the date of the next general election. Mrs. Thatcher's previous parliaments had gone for 4 years rather than 5. And I personally think that if Thatcher had been a bit more fleet of foot in the autumn of 1990 and survived the leadership challenge, which I think was survivable by her at that time, then she probably would have had to go for an election in the spring of 1991, because probably if she hadn't done so, then she probably would have lost the next leadership election, which would have come in the end of 1991, because in those days, the Tory rules were such that you could only challenge a leader once a year, and it was at the sort of November period in the calendar. And Kinnock's foreboding was justified, as you said, Lee, where the Conservatives then experienced something of a bounce in the removal of Margaret Thatcher, who by that point was damaged goods and a polarising figure in the eyes of the electorate. Another of the examples that you gave is this period in the 2019 to 2024 Parliament, or actually really the tail end of the 2017 to 19 Parliament and then the Parliament to follow. If you think about that extraordinary period of volatility in British politics, where in 2017 you see Labour and the Conservatives both get 40+% of the vote each, resulting in the highest combined vote share of the Labour and Conservative parties since 1970. And then, as you mentioned, within just 2 years, at the time of the European elections in 2019, in that parliament, that same parliament after that 2017 election, the two parties get this kind of paltry vote share where they don't even together get to 30% of the vote. It's an extraordinary decline in the support of the two main parties. Basically, in my view, what you had there in 2017 is both parties in their manifesto pledging to implement the referendum vote, then Labour indulging in this, in my view, totally anti-democratic perspective of trying to stop the implementation of the Leave vote in spite of having stood on a manifesto to implement it, Labour losing a huge chunk of its electorate over that, and Theresa May also being unable to deliver Brexit. Now, putting all of that aside, and we can talk about that till the cows come home, I'm always happy to do so. What is notable is this sense of whiplash in the polls, where basically the Brexit tribes end up replacing the solidity of the party identities, where Leave and Remain identities become much, I think, more dominant for most voters than their attachment to Labour or Conservative. And we see that continue to play out in the years to follow. Now, thinking about where we are since the 2024 general election, I mean, what we've seen there is basically, if I just take Labour and Reform, where I think the most interesting changes have occurred, Labour wins the 2024 general election on 34% of the vote. In the immediate polling around that general election, Labour's in the mid-30s. Between the general election and the end of 2024, Labour slides from the mid-30s to the high 20s. 2025 is a bad year for Labour, where Labour slides from the high 20s to the high teens. And then in this year, the first half of 2026, Labour's been basically stuck in the high teens. Reform's fortunes have perhaps unsurprisingly kind of gone in the mirror image version of that. Reform got 14% at the last general election. 2024, it sees its vote go up gently after the general election to the low 20s by the end of 2024. 2025 is the big year of success for Reform, where it rises from the low 20s to the low 30s by the end of that year. And in this year, in 2026, Reform has basically been on a gentle slide from the low 30s to where it is at the moment, which is the mid-20s. And so, although we have seen polling change in the 2024 Parliament, I think it's much more gentle than the volatile, rapid and dramatic changes that we saw in the 2019 Parliament. And so what that might suggest is that there's perhaps less of a sense of, I might say, urgency in the eyes of the electorate in terms of pinning their support to a particular party or not. I think in that febrile time, particularly in 2019, where it was most dramatic, the changes in the polls, I think there was really a sense for many people that this was a now or never moment for Britain. Whether that was your perspective, it was now or never to save Britain's membership of being in the European Union, or certainly it was my view in that time, this was a now or never moment for the integrity of British democracy. Would Britain actually refuse to implement an election result because the political class didn't like the answer? And in that context, I think people were prepared to pin their flags to particular masts that they might not have otherwise considered in the desperation of that moment. Whereas I feel now the stakes obviously are still very high and important in British politics, but they are perhaps, they feel somewhat less existential in the moment. So my feeling on it, and time will soon tell, is that perhaps we might see a gentle rise for Labour after Burnham comes in. For me, I would expect and hope, as a supporter of Labour and of Andy Burnham, that Labour might see a gentle slide into the mid or maybe even upper 20s by the end of this year. That would be, I think, a good conclusion for the year for Labour. And I would expect that, or hope that, Reform might see a gentle slide down into the low 20s and maybe even the upper teens if things are not going well for Reform. I think for me, that's probably the most dramatic change that we could expect in the coming 5 or 6 months, even with the change in Prime Minister, even with the Clacton by-election and Farage's attempt to try to revive some of the limelight back onto him.
You're right to focus on how polling has been both extraordinarily volatile but also quite stable recently. One of the points that I would make around that, in terms of what we may see going forward, so as regular listeners will know, I'm bullish about the two traditional parties of British politics. And one of the reasons why I am, and I think this is something that we may see play out, is that if we look at the great disruptor, or the great disruptors, in fact, let's take two of them in British politics in the last year or so, Reform and the Greens. In Reform's case, I've always felt that Farage provides both the floor and the ceiling on where Reform UK can get in the opinion polls. He is a sufficiently charismatic and compelling figure that a party led by him is unlikely to dip too low in the opinion polls. But also, he has so many negatives. He is, in spite of the fact that many people in Reform speak about Farage as almost a messianic figure, he has so many negatives in the opinion polls. He's a net negative politician in this country by quite some margin, that he also provides the ceiling on where Reform can get to, because too many people really dislike him. I think with the Greens, as more people have seen Zach Polanski, of course, the Greens being the other disruptor in British politics in the last year or so, particularly on the left, and winning a by-election in Greater Manchester. I think as people have seen more of Polanski, they've also decided they like him rather less than may at first have been the case. And he now polls really quite negatively as well. And I think, therefore, whilst he can speak in a way and communicate in a way that does appeal to a chunk of voters, people a few years ago that we may have called Corbynistas, I think all of his negatives also provide a pretty low ceiling, actually, on where the Greens can get to. The good news, and part of my bullishness about the two major parties, is that whilst they both carry so much baggage, Labour and the Conservatives, that they're unlikely to be given the benefit of the doubt by a mass of voters anytime soon, both of their leaders are basically neutral in terms of what the country think of them, which for parties that are polling 20%, give or take, is actually quite a remarkable place for their leaders, or their incoming leader in Burnham's case, to be. And so I think there is a much higher ceiling on where either the Conservatives or the Labour Party can get to, if they get a fair wind and communicate well and have positive policy agendas, and in Burnham's case, if he's seen to deliver in office.
And can I just reflect on where we are now 2 years into this Parliament with the polling? So if we look back at the last general election results, Labour got 34%, the Conservatives got 24%, Reform got 14%, the Lib Dems got 12%, and the Greens got 7%. Now, in that time, I'm going on the basis of the most recent YouGov poll. Labour is down 15 points. The Tories are down 5 points. Reformers up 10 points, the Lib Dems are up 3 points, and the Greens are up 8 points. And what I look at that particularly from Labour's perspective, is I hear various Labour supporters and academics who I would say are on the left of centre, who say to me that the failure of Keir Starmer is that he's focused too much on the reform-facing voters. He needs to do more about appealing to those voters that Labour has lost to the Greens. I really think that that's misjudgment. Even if Labour was able to claw back all of that vote that has gone to the Greens, that would only be half of its recovery where it's lost votes since the general election. And so Labour cannot simply say, well, we're fine and happy for a chunk of Labour voters to have gone to Reform or to the Conservatives, because all we need to do is to squeeze the Green vote. It's not enough. And also, as I often point out, these voters are not very efficiently distributed in the key seats that Labour needs to hold to maintain a majority at the next general election. And so really, one of the reasons why I focused on Labour's decline since the general election and Reform's rise and gentle fall since then is because I think that the path to Labour holding a majority at the next election is in part on its ability to recover ground that it has lost to Reform in the key seats that are necessary to build a Labour majority.
Richard, what's your matter of interest this week?
Well, last month was the end of the term of the US Supreme Court, where there were a variety of high-profile Supreme Court decisions that were published, and one of those was the case Trump versus Barbara, the case relating to birthright citizenship in the United States. In my view, this was an astonishing case for a variety of reasons. First is that I think that the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868 after the American Civil War during this era known as Reconstruction, which I've written a book about, is very obvious and clear in its articulation that those who are born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof always was understood to basically exclude a small category of individuals, basically those who had extraterritoriality in the United States, diplomats, and a quirk of the United States system, Native Americans. But otherwise, those who were born in the United States, whatever the status of the parents, were US citizens. And that was the understanding since the 1860s. There was a case in the 1890s relating to the child of temporary Chinese migrants in the US, where the Supreme Court confirmed this position. Trump, at the start of his presidency, issued an executive order that completely defied 150 odd years of constitutional understanding. And in June, the Supreme Court upheld the view that the 14th Amendment does pertain to children of migrants in the US, regardless of the legal status of the migrants in the US. But it was a remarkably close case. Only 5 of the justices actually took that view, i.e. a bare majority in this case, Trump versus Barbara. Now, this case, as I said, is astonishing for a variety of reasons. One of the other reasons why it's astonishing is that Donald Trump sat in the courtroom during oral arguments, admittedly only to hear his side. He then left when the other side started speaking. Rather rude of him, but I suppose presidents are quite busy. And this was, I think, a way of Trump demonstrating a show of strength to the court, a bit of a flex, I think, in the terms of the young people today, to the court about how important he felt this case was. So this was a loss for Trump, but it was, in my view, an astonishingly narrow loss for Trump. In the immediate aftermath of the decision, Trump issued a truth on his Truth Social platform where he said, "The Supreme Court's ruling is wrong. I will be asking for a rehearing by the United States Supreme Court immediately. This miscarriage of justice will destroy America if they don't change their absolutely insane decision. Thank you for your attention to this matter, President Donald J. Trump. Well, this call by Trump for a rehearing got me to want to learn more about the history of rehearings in the US Supreme Court. Because the US Supreme Court is the final court of appeal in the US system. The Supreme Court is unique in the American system in that they get to choose the cases that they hear, and they can just allow the lower court's judgments to stand in all other cases. And so the court hears about 80 to 90 cases a year out of, I think, something like 14 to 15,000 appeals that are made to the court. And then it's even rarer for the court to hear one of those cases and then to rehear the case. The last time that happened was in the 1960s. And the last time that the Supreme Court reheard a case and changed its decision was back in the mid-1950s. And I thought I would share the facts of that case with our listeners because I think it's a rather interesting case and it has a British tie-in. So the case is called Reed versus Covert. There was a companion case to it, but I'm just going to focus on the main case here, Reed versus Covert, which involved an axe-wielding woman in Upper Heyford, Oxfordshire, and her abusive husband in the 1950s. This woman, Clarice Covert, was an American who was living on the US Air Force base at RAF Upper Heyford near Bicester. After the Second World War, a variety of RAF bases were made at the disposal of the US Air Force. These also include RAF Fairford, which is still used by the US Air Force at the moment. In fact, Lee and I live fairly close to it, and we see the American bombers flying off to Iran on a daily basis at the moment. And also RAF Brize Norton, which has been returned to British use, but was for a period of time used by the Americans. Now, Clarice Covert's husband, Master Sergeant Edward Covert, was reportedly not a very nice man. He was abusive, a drinker, and a gambler. And the couple had 3 children. And one evening, it seems that Clarice snapped. They were in bed. She got an axe and she hacked her husband to death. She then went back to bed, and then the next day she informed the military psychiatrist of what she had done. Under the terms of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, people serving with, employed by, or accompanying US military personnel were bound by the military's rules and jurisdiction subject to international agreements. And it was the case that the British government had agreed to US military jurisdiction over the bases. In other words, these were sort of islands of US jurisdiction in England. And so the British authorities didn't prosecute Clarice Covert for killing this man with an axe. She was prosecuted by an American military court, and she was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Covert was taken to prison in the United States. And while she was in the United States, she issued a habeas corpus petition, which was to say that she was wrongly incarcerated because she should never have been tried in a military court because she was a civilian. And this aspect of the case, not the question of whether she killed her husband or not, there was really no disputing that, but whether or not she'd been rightfully tried for murder was in dispute, and it ended up at the Supreme Court. In June of 1956, the court, in a 5-3-1 decision, I'll come back to that one in a moment, found that Mrs. Covert was subject to the jurisdiction of the US military while in Upper Heyford in England because of this aspect of the US military code. Now, I said it's a 5-3-1 decision, and that's rather unusual. The one was a statement issued by Justice Felix Frankfurter called a reservation. Normally you have the opinion of the court, a concurrence, or a dissent, But here he issued a reservation. And the reservation that Frankfurter issued was that he believed that he needed more time to come to a view. So basically, he couldn't make up his mind by the June deadline when the court issued its decision. And it was that uncertainty from Frankfurter that Covert's legal team seized upon, and they issued a petition for her case to be reheard. And extraordinarily, I mean, this really is very, very rare. It hasn't happened in the United States in 60 years, although Trump is asking for it to happen in this current case, Trump versus Barbara. The court agreed to rehear the whole case. And so in the following spring, there were oral arguments. And at the end of that session, the court issued its verdict where it said, we got it wrong. We were wrong the first time. In fact, we're going to take the completely opposite view. Mrs. Covert should never have been tried in a military court. She should have been tried in a civilian court. Now, part of the reason this reversal happened is because two of the justices on the court retired in the meantime. One of the justices who'd previously ruled against Mrs. Covert changed his mind. Frankfurter finally made his decision in Mrs. Covert's failure. And so basically all of that change lined up in Mrs. Covert's favor, and what had been a 5-3 to 1 decision against her became a 6-2 decision in her favor. And basically the long and short of this is that Mrs. Covert was released from prison because it had been found that she'd been wrongly tried. There was no civilian court that could try her because the British had agreed not to exercise jurisdiction on the US military bases. And at that time, there was no provision for US civilian courts to operate on crimes committed outside the United States in England. And so she went from being in prison for life for murder, for killing her husband with an axe, to scot-free, never charged again. And she moved to Arizona, where she became an archaeologist, and she worked at the Museum of Northern Arizona for the rest of her career. And she died in the 1990s, in her 70s. By this point, she had her 3 children with the late Mr. Covert, who she'd killed, and they had produced grandchildren, even great-grandchildren, by the time that she died. So in an extraordinary case, one I didn't know about until Trump had issued this declaration, it would be almost unfathomable that Trump would be able to get the Supreme Court to agree to rehear this case. You need a majority of judges to agree to do so. But Trump did get FIFA to strike off a red card against the United States' best player in the World Cup, something that hadn't happened in, I think, 50 years. So Trump has a good record lately with getting institutions to reverse major decisions that they had previously made. And so perhaps he will be successful in this case too. Time will tell.
Well, it's a fascinating case, and I often say it's all happening in Oxfordshire, and clearly at that time it was very much for ill in terms of the murdered man's case. Now, they could have argued about whether or not this lady was put in such an appalling situation by her husband's abuse that this was seen as being a legitimate action or an excusable action, we may say, of what she did. That's a separate argument that could have been had in a court of law.
And she did try to argue she'd been driven insane by her husband's abuse.
And that is a debate that could have been had. The fact that it seemed to fall down on some sort of legalistic idea of, well, who really has rights or jurisdiction is just infuriating. And I loathe the fact that so much of modern law often seems to fall down on technicalities.
Well, it's the combination, I think, particularly egregious in the US, although you can also see this in other jurisdictions as well, where it's the technicalities married to politics. Because the reason the technicality was able to exonerate Mrs. Covert was because of changes on which judges were sitting on the court, who was retiring at that particular time. She just got very lucky that 2 of the justices who had gone against her in the original case were off the court by the time oral argument was rehad. And I suppose, who knows, maybe Trump thinks himself a lucky man and thinks that perhaps he can get either a justice to change his mind or her mind, which was what also happened in this case. Marshall Harlan flipped his vote, which was very helpful for Mrs. Covert. I think Trump would like pressure on one of the Republican appointees who went against him to flip their vote this time. But ultimately, the decisions of the justices are never made on the basis of, well, for political reasons, I've had to change my view. It's, well, actually, this technical aspect of the Constitution says X, Y, and Z. And I think it's a sign of the dangers of vesting too much power in courts.
Clearly, Trump sitting there, who was an attempt to try and exert some political power in that situation. And what it brought to mind for me was actually a different example, but a sort of similar thought process perhaps, which was in February of 2017, when people will remember the Brexit process of trying to leave the European Union. And there was a court case which was highly politically charged, the Gina Miller court cases, about whether or not triggering Article 50 and beginning the process of leaving the European Union required legislation, or whether or not it was a function of the royal prerogative, and thus the government itself could do it and the Prime Minister could do it. The court ruled that it had to have a law giving effect to it. And that led to the EU notification of withdrawal bill being introduced. And what was quite fascinating about that process was when it went to the House of Lords, the government was very keen that the legislation not be amended in any way. And one of the ways in which the government tried to assert, you could say, some pressure on the Lords is that Theresa May, the then Prime Minister, sat on the steps of the throne in the House of Lords to watch the debate. And this was widely interpreted as being a way for the Democratic chamber to basically give a signal to the unelected chamber, the House of Lords, that we are implementing here the outcome of the biggest democratic vote in this country's history. Do not play around with this. Stay in your box, give or take. As it happens, the Lords did pass 2 amendments, which went then back to the Commons subsequently. But that was an attempt, I think, really just to try and signal by your presence a sense of power and influence. It's interesting how sometimes different actors within the Constitution try and play their roles in both the formal and well understood ways. Of course, different branches of government do always formally interact with each other, but also sometimes informally as well, to try and nudge other actors more in your direction.
I wonder if you think those times when leaders place themselves in a different chamber from the one that they are meant to be in, so to speak, is helpful for them, or if it's counterproductive. There was a lot of speculation at the time when Trump sat in the oral arguments of Trump versus Barbara that he might be seen as trying to intimidate the justices and actually therefore might stir a sort of backlash against him. And I wonder if you felt with Theresa May, whether her presence in the House of Lords achieved what she wanted it to achieve, or whether it sort of got the backs up of the Lords who felt, who is this woman to disrespect our cameral prerogatives here as a different chamber in Parliament?
I suspect it probably does stiffen resolve, particularly when it's a chamber or a branch of government that has particular functions in its exercising, and also particularly in both of those cases, where people have a role that the person who's trying to pressure them cannot take away from them, because Supreme Court appointments and peerages are for life. It's an intricate and messy dance always between different branches of government or different chambers of Parliament. But I don't think just sitting there necessarily does much at all.
You sometimes see MPs do something like this, where they'll invite relevant interest groups who are affected by proposed legislation to sit in the gallery in the House of Commons. And again, it's sort of, I suppose it's meant to make visible to legislators I suppose it's partly to put a little bit more pressure on those wavering legislators about the sense of the wider consequences of the decisions that they make beyond the chamber itself. But then again, I don't really know how useful it is.
Well, that's all for this midweek episode. We'll be back on Sunday, and this week we're continuing our Summer Book Club theme and interviewing Vince Cable. Cable was, of course, a minister in the coalition government. He was a one-time leader of the Liberal Democrats, And in this episode, we talk a little bit about his role in government and politics, but also his latest book, in which he discusses the current global economy and its relationship to geopolitics and what that's going to look like in the future. That'll be out on Sunday morning, wherever you get your podcasts. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.